The wind carried a faint chill across the Tennessee Valley that morning when Ruth stepped off the worn bus that had brought her back to the place she once called home. The village had not changed as much as she imagined. The same church steeple rose above the line of trees, the same gravel road curved toward the square, and the same distant hills stood like quiet witnesses of everything that had ever happened here. Time had moved, but in this corner of the world it moved softly, leaving behind the shape of every story that refused to be forgotten. Ruth adjusted the strap of her small suitcase and looked at the landscape as if it might speak to her. The air smelled of pine and dry grass, and the faint sound of a rooster came from somewhere down the hill. It was strange how familiar it felt after so many years. The road ahead seemed to remember her steps even before she took them. 30 years earlier, she had left this place with nothing but the clothes she wore and the sound of rain behind her. That departure had not been quiet. People had watched through their curtains, whispering, guessing, judging. Some said she would never come back. Others said she did not deserve to. But now she was here, standing in the same dust, breathing the same air, wondering whether anyone would even recognize the woman she had become. Her hair was silver now, her hands showed the years, and her eyes carried more calm than sadness. The past had burned itself out slowly, leaving her with ashes she no longer feared to touch. Still, as she looked toward the old church, something deep in her chest trembled. She had promised herself she would not cry today. She had come to face what was left, not to escape again. The road to her childhood house was lined with oak trees that reached over the path like arms trying to hold the sky together. She walked slowly, taking in each sound. The gravel shifted under her shoes, the leaves rustled above, and a crow called out from the distance. Each sound felt like a memory returning to life. She remembered the smell of her mother's biscuits in the morning, the way her father's boots left marks by the porch, the laughter of children running through fields of golden weeds. But most of all, she remembered the silence that followed the night she left. That silence had followed her everywhere she went. Cities, jobs, and people had come and gone, but none of them replaced the weight of a home abandoned. The house appeared just as the sun broke through the clouds. The paint was peeling, the roof sagged a little, but the porch still stood strong. The sight of it hit her harder than she expected. Every board, every crack, every broken step carried a story. She could almost hear her younger self shouting from the yard, her mother calling from the kitchen window, and her father's steady voice reading scripture by the lamp. She took a deep breath and opened the old gate. It creaked, as if surprised to be touched again. The path to the door was overgrown with grass, but her feet found their way without thinking. She reached the door and placed her hand on the handle. For a moment, she closed her eyes. She wasn't sure what she expected to find. Maybe emptiness, maybe ghosts, maybe forgiveness. When she pushed the door open, a gust of cool air met her face. Dust hung in the sunlight like slow rain. The room was small, filled with shadows and the faint scent of cedar. The old furniture remained, covered with sheets, untouched by time. It felt as though someone had left everything waiting, as if life here had simply paused. She walked through the room, her hand brushing the top of a table where she once did her homework. On the wall still hung a faded cross and a small framed photograph of her parents. The glass was cracked, but their faces were clear. Her mother's eyes seemed kind, her father's gaze steady. Ruth touched the frame gently, her throat tightening. 30 years gone, and yet it felt like yesterday. She whispered a quiet prayer, not for the past, but for strength to stand in its presence. Outside, a bell rang from the church tower, announcing morning service. The sound traveled through the valley, steady and familiar. Ruth turned toward the window. She had forgotten that feeling, how that sound carried meaning, not just time. People would be walking toward the church now, dressed in their Sunday best, carrying the weight of routine faith. Would they remember her? Would they whisper again? Or would they simply nod, pretending the years had washed everything away? She hesitated for a long moment before deciding to go. She wanted to see who had remained, who had grown old, and whether forgiveness was still possible among them. The path to the church took her past the old mill, now covered in ivy, and across the small wooden bridge over the creek. The water moved slowly, glinting in the light, the same way it used to when she was a girl throwing stones with her brother. The memory of him caught her off guard. She had not spoken his name in decades. Samuel. He had been younger, restless and proud. The argument that tore them apart had started with anger, but ended with silence. He had said words she never forgot. She had said worse. When she left, he did not try to stop her. She wondered if he was still alive, if he had ever missed her. The thought tightened her chest, but she kept walking. As the church came into view, she noticed small details she had forgotten. The cracked steps at the entrance, the faded white paint, the flower beds that once smelled of lilac. She paused at the gate. A group of people stood near the door, talking quietly before the service began. Their faces were older, lined with years of sun and sorrow, but she recognized some of them. Mrs. Collins, who used to sell pies, Mr. Bradley, who ran the post office, and near the doorway, a woman with kind eyes and grey hair pinned back neatly, Martha, her childhood friend. Ruth's heart pounded. She almost turned away, but Martha looked up and their eyes met. For a moment, the world fell still. Then Martha's mouth opened slightly, as if she were seeing something she had prayed for, but never expected again. "Ruth," the woman breathed out, almost without sound, though Ruth heard it clear as the bell itself. Martha stepped forward, uncertain, then faster, her eyes filling with emotion. Ruth wanted to speak, but her throat refused. When they reached each other, Martha took her hands and just held them. No words were needed. The years between them folded like a page, turning back to where it once began. Around them, people stopped to look, whispers spreading like the wind through wheat. Some faces showed surprise, some confusion, and some something deeper, recognition. Ruth could feel the weight of all those eyes, but for the first time she did not shrink. She had carried shame long enough. Whatever was to be said, whatever was to be remembered, she was ready to face it. Inside, the church smelled of wood polish and candle wax. The same benches, the same windows, the same pulpit stood as they always had. Ruth sat near the back, her hands resting in her lap. The hymn began, soft and slow, the voices rising like a prayer woven from memory. Her eyes wandered over the congregation, faces familiar and faces new, children who had grown, elders who had stayed. Then, near the front, her gaze stopped. An old man stood by the organ, his posture straight despite his age. His hair was white, his shoulders broad. There was something unmistakable about him. When he turned slightly, her breath caught. It was Samuel, her brother. Time had carved its marks on him, but his expression still carried that same quiet pride. He looked up, and their eyes met. For a second, disbelief crossed his face, then shock, then something she could not name. The hymn ended, and silence settled across the room. Samuel's hand trembled slightly as he rested it on the organ. He looked at her again, as if to confirm that the ghost before him was real. Ruth stayed still. Neither of them spoke, but something passed between them, the kind of understanding that words cannot reach. Then Samuel turned away, his jaw tightening, and began the next hymn. The congregation followed, their voices uncertain, but Ruth could not join. She watched him, remembering the boy who once promised to protect her, the man who had turned his back, and now the old soul who still carried the weight of their story. After the service, the crowd lingered outside. Martha stayed close, introducing her softly to others, trying to ease the awkwardness that filled the air. Some offered kind smiles, some kept their distance. Ruth answered politely, though her eyes searched for Samuel. He stood a little apart, speaking with the pastor. She could see the struggle in his posture, pride against forgiveness, memory against the present. She wanted to approach, to tell him that she had come not for apologies, but for peace. But before she could move, he walked away down the path behind the church. She watched him go, her heart heavy yet strangely calm. Some wounds take time to reopen before they can heal. When the crowd finally dispersed, Ruth stood by the church fence, looking toward the hills. The afternoon light had grown soft, painting the fields with gold. She realized how much she had missed this quiet beauty. For years, she had lived among strangers, working, surviving, trying not to remember. Yet here, even the silence seemed to speak of belonging. She turned to Martha and smiled faintly. "I think I'll stay a while," she said, her voice steady, as if the decision had always been waiting. Martha nodded, her eyes shining. You should. Some hearts never stop waiting. That evening, Ruth returned to the old house. She lit a small oil lamp and sat by the window. The valley stretched out before her, calm and endless. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell rang again, softer this time, as if welcoming her home. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in 30 years, she felt that she had come to the right place. Morning came with a thin mist that rolled across the valley and settled over the rooftops like a gentle memory. Ruth woke early, not because she had slept well, but because her heart was restless. The house creaked around her, as if stretching after a long sleep. Light entered through the cracks in the shutters, cutting across the room and landing on the wooden floor where dust floated lazily. She sat by the edge of the bed and let her eyes wander. The silence was no longer heavy, it was alive. Every sound carried meaning now. The chirping of birds, the hum of insects outside, the slow ticking of a clock that somehow still worked after all those years. It felt like the house had been waiting for her, keeping its breath until she returned. She made her way to the small kitchen, where an old kettle still rested on the stove. Her fingers traced its surface, remembering mornings when her mother filled it with water and hummed softly while waiting for it to boil. Ruth found a few pieces of wood by the door and lit the stove. The smell of smoke filled the air, blending with the scent of thyme. She poured water and watched it bubble, a simple act that brought her comfort. There was peace in these quiet gestures. After 30 years of running from her past, even the smallest routine felt like a gift. She sat by the window, holding a cup of tea, and looked outside. The valley spread out before her, calm and patient. She realized that life here had its own rhythm, slow, deliberate, untouched by hurry. In the city, everything had been noise and movement. Here, silence spoke louder than words. Her thoughts wandered to Samuel. She could not erase the image of him standing by the organ, his face torn between shock and resistance. She had imagined that reunion countless times, but never like this. She had thought he might smile, or cry, or at least say her name. Instead, he had turned away. It hurt, but she understood. Time can soften pain, but pride can keep it alive. She knew she could not rush forgiveness. She only hoped he would one day look at her and see not the girl who left, but the woman who returned. Ruth placed the cup down and stood. There was much to do. The house needed care, the garden needed tending, and perhaps she needed a reason to stay busy while her heart settled. Outside, the morning air was cool and clear. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and the fence leaned slightly, but the soil still looked fertile. She found an old rake by the shed and began clearing the path. The work was slow, but it grounded her. Each movement carried rhythm, like a prayer repeated by the body. The sun climbed higher, warming her shoulders. As she worked, she noticed how the village had changed just enough to remind her that life had gone on. The road was smoother now, some houses newly painted, and the church roof had been repaired. Yet the people moved with the same quiet patience as always. They carried baskets, exchanged greetings, and paused to talk at the gate. From a distance, she could hear laughter, the kind that only small towns still held onto. By noon, she was tired but content. She sat on the porch and wiped her hands with a cloth. The sound of footsteps approached from the road. Ruth lifted her eyes and saw Martha coming toward her, carrying a basket covered with a linen cloth. The sight of that familiar figure brought warmth to her heart. Martha climbed the steps and set the basket down on the railing. Inside were loaves of bread, apples, and a jar of honey. "I thought you might need a proper meal," Martha said gently. Ruth smiled and thanked her. They sat together for a while, eating and talking about small things, the weather, the harvest, the children who had grown up and moved away. There was comfort in those simple exchanges. For a moment, it almost felt like the years between them had vanished. Martha spoke of the town with quiet pride. She told her how the church had survived storms, how the pastor still preached from the same worn Bible, and how people still came every Sunday, no matter the distance. Ruth listened, feeling a mix of nostalgia and humility. Then Martha grew more serious. She spoke softly, choosing her words carefully. "Samuel has changed," she said. "He's quieter now. spends his days at the church fixing things, helping others, but he never speaks of the past. Maybe seeing you stirred something he buried long ago. Ruth looked at the fields beyond the house, her thoughts heavy. I didn't come to ask for his forgiveness, she said. I came to give mine. Martha nodded, understanding. Then you already did more than most ever would. As afternoon turned to evening, Ruth decided to visit the cemetery behind the church. It had been her parents' resting place for 3 decades. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers she had gathered from the field and walked slowly along the dirt path. The air smelled of earth and pine. The sky above was painted with streaks of orange and pink. When she reached the gate, she paused. The rows of stones stretched before her like quiet sentinels of time. She found their graves near the back, shaded by an old willow. Kneeling down, she brushed away the leaves that had gathered over the years. Her fingers traced the names carved into stone, names that once filled her home with life. She whispered a prayer of gratitude, not for the past itself, but for the chance to face it without fear. The tears that came were not of sorrow, but release. As she stood to leave, she noticed another grave a few rows away. The stone was newer, the writing still clear. It bore a name she recognized, Sarah Bradley. The memory returned slowly. Sarah had been her closest friend after Martha, the one who had defended her when others turned away. But Sarah had fallen ill the year Ruth left and had passed soon after. The realization struck her with quiet sadness. She placed a hand over the stone and whispered a promise to visit again. As she walked back through the cemetery, she felt something shift inside her, a sense of belonging she had not felt in decades. Even in loss, she was part of this land again. That night, she lit the lamp and opened a small wooden box she had found in the bedroom. Inside were letters yellowed by time, tied together with string. Her hands trembled as she untied the knot. The first letter was from her father, written the year before she left. His handwriting was firm and deliberate. He had written about faith, about forgiveness, and about how love must outlast mistakes. Ruth read the words slowly, her eyes stinging. How strange that she had run so far from this wisdom, only to find it again at the end of the road. She folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the lamp. She would keep it there, as a reminder that some words never lose their truth. Days turned into weeks, and Ruth settled into a quiet rhythm. She fixed the fence, planted flowers, and cleaned the rooms one by one. The villagers began to greet her kindly when she passed. Some brought small gifts, jars of jam, fresh eggs, homemade soap. The walls of suspicion were falling, replaced by cautious respect. But one person remained distant. Samuel still avoided her. He walked past her house sometimes, carrying tools or firewood, but he never looked her way. Ruth watched from the porch, her heart steady but hopeful. She believed that time, just as it had once separated them, could now bring them closer again. One morning, while she was tending to the garden, the pastor from the church approached. His name was Reverend Hayes, a tall man with kind eyes and a gentle voice. He greeted her warmly and said he was glad she had returned. He spoke of the upcoming harvest service and invited her to attend. "It's a time for gratitude," he said, "and perhaps for mending what's been broken." Ruth thanked him, promising she would come. When he left, she felt a quiet conviction growing in her chest. Maybe this was why she had been brought back, not just to face the past, but to heal what time had left undone. The day of the harvest service arrived with clear skies and crisp air. The fields shimmered with gold, and the church was decorated with pumpkins, corn stalks, and garlands of dried flowers. People gathered early, their faces bright with anticipation. Ruth arrived a little before noon, wearing a simple dress and carrying a basket of apples she had polished that morning. Inside the church, the air was filled with the scent of candles and bread. She found a seat near the middle, surrounded by familiar faces. When the hymn began, her voice joined theirs, soft but steady. She looked toward the front and saw Samuel again. He was helping the pastor arrange the offerings. Their eyes met briefly, and though he didn't smile, he didn't turn away either. It was enough. As the service ended, Reverend Hayes spoke about renewal and forgiveness. His words seemed to hang in the air, touching every heart in the room. He said that sometimes God does not erase the past, but transforms it into a lesson. Ruth felt tears rising. When the final prayer was spoken, she stayed seated, letting the others leave first. The church slowly emptied. and silence returned. She stood, walked to the front and placed her basket beside the altar. It was a small offering, but it carried a lifetime of meaning. When she turned to leave, she saw Samuel standing by the doorway. Their eyes met once more. This time he nodded. It was slight, almost hesitant, but it was a beginning. Outside, the sun had started to dip, spreading long shadows across the road. Martha waited by the gate, smiling as Ruth approached. "You see," she said softly, "he's starting to see you again." Ruth nodded, her heart light. As they walked home together, she felt a quiet joy she hadn't known in years. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time it led somewhere worth walking. Where in the world are you watching from? Leave it down below in the comments. The days after the harvest service carried a quiet peace that Ruth had not known in years. The air grew colder, the colors of the fields faded into shades of brown and gold, and smoke rose gently from chimneys around the valley. Life followed a rhythm that never hurried and never stopped. Ruth found herself fitting into it little by little, as if time itself was teaching her how to live again. Each morning she woke before sunrise, watching the first light spill over the hills. It reminded her that even the darkest nights had to end somewhere. She would open the window, breathe in the cool air, and whisper a short prayer of gratitude before starting the day. The townspeople had grown used to her presence again. When she passed through the square, people greeted her with nods and cautious smiles. Some still whispered, but the sharpness of their words had softened. In small towns, memories run deep, but so does forgiveness when given time. Ruth spent her days helping where she could. She baked bread for the church gatherings, brought apples to the school teacher, and sat with Martha when the evenings grew long. There was comfort in the ordinary. Sometimes the quiet acts of kindness healed what grand gestures could not. She was rebuilding her place, not through words, but through quiet persistence. One afternoon, Martha mentioned that Samuel had started working on repairing the church roof. The storm a few weeks earlier had loosened the boards, and he had taken it upon himself to fix them before winter came. Ruth listened, her heart stirring with a strange mix of pride and longing. She remembered how Samuel had always been the one to mend what was broken, tools, fences, even people. It felt right that he was still doing it. She thought of offering to help, but fear held her back. She wasn't sure if her presence would heal or reopen wounds. Still, something inside her urged her not to wait too long. Time had already taken enough from them. The next morning she gathered her courage. She packed a small basket with sandwiches and a thermos of tea and walked toward the church. The road was quiet, except for the crunch of gravel beneath her shoes. When she reached the yard, she saw Samuel on the roof, hammering boards with steady precision. The sight of him brought back countless memories. The two of them running through fields as children, building wooden toy houses with their father, laughing under the summer rain. He had aged, but the strength in his movements was still there. Ruth placed the basket on the steps and looked up. For a long moment she hesitated, unsure how to speak. Then she simply said, "You might need a break." Samuel paused mid-swing, turned his head slightly and looked down. Their eyes met again. He didn't answer, but after a while he climbed down the ladder and sat on the edge of the steps. They shared the meal in silence. Words felt too fragile to hold the weight of 30 years. Samuel ate slowly, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough from years of restraint. "You shouldn't have come back." Ruth nodded softly. "I know." He turned to her, his eyes filled with something between anger and sorrow. "You left when we needed you most. You let everything fall apart." She looked down at her hands. "I was young and I was afraid. I thought leaving would make the pain stop." He shook his head. It didn't. His tone was not cruel, just tired. Ruth nodded again. "No, it never did." They sat together for a while longer, the sound of wind filling the space between them. When Samuel finally stood to return to work, he didn't say goodbye, but he didn't turn his back on her either. It was not forgiveness, but it was not rejection. It was a start. After that day, Ruth visited the church often. She brought food, swept the floors, and helped decorate for the winter service. Sometimes Samuel was there, sometimes not. When he was, they worked side by side in quiet cooperation. No apologies were exchanged, but the silence between them began to feel less heavy. It carried a quiet respect, like two travelers sharing a long road without needing to speak. The villagers noticed and whispered about how the past might finally be finding its rest. Martha watched them from afar, her heart full of hope. She believed that some stories do not end in separation, they only pause until grace returns. As winter settled over the valley, the nights grew longer and colder. Ruth found comfort in her small house, now warm with the glow of the oil lamp and the smell of wood smoke. She spent evenings mending clothes, writing in a small journal, and reading passages from her father's old Bible. One verse stayed with her: "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven." She repeated it often, letting the words sink into her heart. Maybe this was her season to make peace. Maybe this was her time to find purpose again. One afternoon, as she walked to the market, she passed the old schoolhouse. Children's laughter spilled through the open windows, bright and full of life. A small boy ran out to chase a rolling hoop, his cheeks red from the cold. He tripped and fell near her feet, and she quickly helped him up. "Thank you, ma'am," he said shyly, brushing the dirt from his clothes. Ruth smiled and handed him the hoop. "You remind me of my brother when he was your age," she said softly. The boy grinned before running back inside. She watched him go, realizing how much she had missed the sound of children. That simple encounter filled her with warmth. Life, it seemed, still had room for small joys. That evening, Martha visited again, bringing news that made Ruth's heart tighten. Samuel had fallen from the church roof earlier that day. The ladder had slipped on wet ground, and though he was alive, he had hurt his leg badly. He was resting at home, unable to move much. Without thinking, Ruth stood and began gathering her shawl and coat. "I have to see him," she said firmly. Martha nodded, knowing there was no point in stopping her. The night was cold as Ruth walked through the village, the moon casting silver light on the road. When she reached Samuel's house, she hesitated at the door. She had crossed many thresholds in her life, but none felt as heavy as this one. She knocked softly, and after a moment, a familiar voice called from inside. Samuel was lying on the sofa, his leg wrapped in bandages. The room was dim, lit only by a small lamp. He looked surprised to see her, but didn't ask her to leave. Ruth stepped inside and placed a bowl of soup on the table. "Martha told me," she said quietly. "I brought something warm." Samuel nodded, his eyes softening just slightly. "You didn't have to." "I know," she answered, "but I wanted to." She helped him sit up and handed him the bowl. For the first time in years, their conversation flowed without strain. They spoke of ordinary things, the weather, the harvest, the repairs left unfinished. It was not what they said that mattered, but the way they said it. The walls between them were beginning to crack, not from confrontation, but from care. Over the next few days, Ruth visited often. She cooked, cleaned, and made sure Samuel had everything he needed. The townspeople noticed and began to see them together again. Whispers changed from curiosity to admiration. Some said the Lord had finally done his work in them. Others simply smiled, knowing that some families find their way back when the world least expects it. As Samuel recovered, his attitude softened. He started to thank her more, to ask about her days, to listen when she spoke. One evening, as she prepared to leave, he said something that stayed with her. "You know, Ruth, I used to think forgiveness was something you gave. Now I think it's something you grow." She turned to him, her eyes gentle. "Maybe we're finally growing it then." He smiled faintly. "Maybe we are." The weeks passed, and with each day the frost on the fields thickened. Winter had truly arrived, but inside Ruth's heart, something else was blooming, a quiet renewal that no cold could reach. She spent Christmas Eve at the church, surrounded by candles and hymns. The village gathered, their voices lifting together in warmth. Samuel sat near the front, his leg still healing, but his spirit lighter than it had been in years. When the final carol ended, he turned and met her eyes. In that look was everything they had left unsaid: sorrow, forgiveness, and love that had survived silence. Ruth felt tears rise but did not hide them. Some endings are not about regret, but about the peace that follows. That night, when she returned home, The moon hung full above the valley. The house glowed softly, the air filled with the scent of pine and hope. Ruth sat by the window and thought of how far she had come. She had arrived a stranger and found herself again among the same fields that had once sent her away. She had faced what she feared most and discovered it was never too late to come home. As she closed her eyes, she realized that forgiveness was not a single moment, but a journey, one that she and Samuel were still walking together, step by step, guided by grace. Snow came early that year, settling over the Tennessee Valley like a quiet blessing. The rooftops turned white, the trees bowed under the weight, and every sound seemed softened by the thick blanket of winter. Ruth stood at her window, watching flakes drift slowly past the glass. Each one landed as if the earth had been waiting for it. The stillness carried both peace and memory, a silence filled not with emptiness, but with rest. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and felt a warmth that came not just from the fire but from something deeper, a calm acceptance that life had finally begun to heal the open places in her heart. Her days found rhythm again. Morning fires, fresh bread, visits to neighbors. The village moved at the same steady pace it always had, even when the cold bit at the air. Samuel's leg was healing well. He had returned to light work at the church, limping slightly, but moving with renewed strength. Ruth often brought him soup or coffee, and though they still spoke carefully, their silence no longer hurt. The years between them seemed smaller now, as if shared kindness could fill the distance that regret had once built. People in the village began to notice. They said that time, like snow, covers what once looked barren, making even the hardest ground look pure again. One afternoon, as Ruth was sweeping the porch, Martha came walking up the path. Her face was bright with the cold, and her smile carried good news. The pastor had asked if Ruth would help organize the church charity fair before the new year. It was a small tradition, a gathering to raise food and blankets for families in need. Ruth agreed immediately. She had come to see the church not only as a building of worship, but as a place where life continued to weave itself together through the simplest acts of care. Over the next few days, she and Martha worked side by side, preparing tables, sorting donations, and baking pies to sell. Children ran through the hall laughing, their voices echoing against the wooden walls. The sound filled Ruth with warmth. For so many years she had avoided people, afraid of their judgment. Now she found comfort in belonging to them again. The fair day arrived, with clear skies. The churchyard buzzed with activity. Tables lined the path with baked goods, crafts, and baskets of produce. The smell of cinnamon and coffee filled the air. Ruth stood behind one of the tables, arranging jars of preserves she had made. Samuel worked nearby, helping to lift boxes and greet visitors. Occasionally their eyes met, and though words passed rarely, their glances said more than conversation ever could. He carried the quiet assurance of a man who had finally stopped fighting his own heart. In the afternoon, the pastor gathered everyone to pray. His words spoke of community, of second chances, of how mercy binds people stronger than memory ever could. Ruth bowed her head, feeling the truth of it settle inside her. When the fair ended, the last of the sun touched the snow-covered hills with gold. The villagers lingered, sharing laughter and gratitude. As Ruth began packing up, Samuel approached, holding 2 cups of hot cider. He offered one to her, and she took it with a small smile. They stood in silence, watching the sky darken. After a moment, he said quietly, "You know, I used to believe that coming back would only bring pain. I was wrong." She looked at him, her eyes soft. "Sometimes the only way to heal a place is to walk through it again." He nodded slowly. "Maybe that's what we've been doing." The warmth of his voice carried forgiveness not yet spoken but fully felt. It was enough to make the cold air seem gentle. As the weeks passed, winter deepened. The days were short, and the nights stretched endlessly across the valley. But Ruth did not fear the darkness anymore. She found peace in routine, lighting the lamp at dusk, reading by the fire, hearing the faint sounds of life drifting through the night. She had discovered that solitude was no longer loneliness when the heart was at peace. Sometimes she would look at the framed photograph of her parents on the wall and feel that they too could see how far she had come. The house no longer felt haunted by the past. It was filled with presence, with love remembered, love restored, and love still unfolding. One evening, a knock came at the door. It was Samuel. He stood there holding a folded piece of paper and a shy expression. "I thought you might want to see this," he said. She invited him in, and he handed her the paper. It was a notice from the county about the sale of their parents' old farmland outside the village. The property had been abandoned for years. The barn collapsed, the fields overtaken by weeds. Ruth's eyes moved slowly across the words. "They're going to sell it?" she asked quietly. Samuel nodded. "The county wants to auction it off. I thought maybe we should see it before it's gone for good." She hesitated, the idea stirring emotions she had buried long ago. That land had been the center of everything they once were. Family, work, faith. It was where their childhood lived. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow," he said simply. The next morning, they set out together. The path to the farm was long and covered in frost, but their steps matched easily. Neither spoke much, yet their silence carried understanding. When they reached the hilltop, the old barn came into view, half collapsed, the roof sunken, the wood grey with age. The house beside it was barely standing, windows broken, door hanging loose. Ruth stopped, her breath catching. This was where her story had begun, and perhaps where it needed to find its full circle. She walked slowly toward the porch, the boards creaking underfoot. Inside, dust covered everything, but traces of their parents' life remained. A cracked mug, a worn Bible, the faint outline of a chair by the window. Samuel stood behind her, his face unreadable. "I thought it would hurt more to see it," he said softly. Ruth nodded. "It hurts, but not the way it used to. It feels like remembering, not losing." They spent the day clearing the debris, gathering small things that still carried meaning. A photograph, a tool, a piece of fabric. It was less about saving objects and more about honoring what had been. When the sun began to set, they sat on the porch steps, watching the light fade over the valley. The world looked quiet, eternal. Samuel turned to her. "Do you think we could buy it back? Just the land? Keep it in the family?" Ruth thought for a long moment. "It's not about owning it," she said. "It's about letting it rest. Some things are meant to be released." He smiled faintly. "Maybe you're right." They sat there in silence, the peace between them no longer fragile, but whole. That evening Ruth wrote in her journal by the firelight. She wrote about the land, about forgiveness, about how love does not vanish. It changes shape and finds new ways to live. Her words flowed easily now, as if they had been waiting all her life to be written. She realized that her return to the village had not been about the past at all. It had been about finding strength to face what once felt unbearable and discovering grace where she least expected it. Each line she wrote felt like a prayer answered slowly, through time and mercy. A few days later, the county auction took place. Samuel and Ruth stood at the edge of the crowd, watching quietly as the old farm was sold. Neither spoke, but when the papers were signed and the crowd dispersed, they stayed behind, looking across the empty field. "It's gone," Samuel said softly. "No," Ruth replied. "It's been given back to the earth. It's home again." He looked at her and smiled. In that moment, both understood that letting go was not the same as losing. It was a different kind of keeping, one that lived in memory, not possession. That night, as the village lights flickered in the distance, Ruth walked home through the falling snow. Each step left a mark that the wind would soon cover, but for now, they were hers alone. The world felt vast and tender, like a story that had finally found its ending, but still wanted to be told. When she reached her door, she looked back toward the hills and whispered a silent thank you to the land, to time, to forgiveness itself. Then she stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her, knowing she had come full circle, yet still had life left to live. The new year arrived quietly in the village. Snow still covered the fields, and smoke rose from every chimney, tracing grey lines against the pale sky. Ruth spent the first morning of January sitting by the window, watching the faint movement of people down the road. Life in small towns never paused for long. Even in winter there were chores to do, animals to feed, and paths to clear. The rhythm of survival was steady, unchanging. She liked that about this place. It reminded her that peace was not something that came from comfort, but from the quiet discipline of living one honest day after another. The church bell rang just after noon, calling the villagers to the first service of the year. Ruth dressed warmly and made her way there, her boots crunching through the snow. The air was sharp, but the sound of the bell softened it somehow. Inside, the church glowed with candlelight. Families filled the pews, and the smell of pine and wax hung thick in the air. She took a seat near the back, her eyes tracing the worn wood of the walls. Reverend Hayes spoke about new beginnings and the grace of being allowed to start again. He said that forgiveness is not an ending, but a door, and sometimes the hardest part is believing that we deserve to walk through it. Ruth listened in silence, feeling as though his words had been written for her alone. After the service, people lingered outside to talk. Martha waved from across the yard and came to her side, her cheeks red from the cold. "There's a supper tonight at the hall," she said. "Everyone will be there. You should come." Ruth smiled faintly. "I'll try," she replied, though she wasn't sure she would. Crowds still made her uneasy. But later that afternoon, as the light began to fade, she found herself walking toward the hall anyway. Something about the laughter she heard from a distance drew her closer. Inside, the room was warm and full of life. Tables overflowed with food, and the air buzzed with conversation. Children played near the fireplace, their faces lit with joy. Samuel sat with a group of older men near the window, talking quietly. When he saw her enter, he nodded, a simple gesture that made her heart lift. The evening passed with warmth and laughter. Martha insisted Ruth try every dish, and people asked about her garden and her plans for spring. For the first time, she felt not like a visitor, but like someone who truly belonged. Later, as music began to play from an old violin, Samuel stood and offered his hand. She hesitated, surprised, but then smiled and accepted. They moved slowly, not as dancers, but as two people learning how to stand side by side again. The others watched with gentle approval. It wasn't romance that bound them. It was forgiveness, steady and real, turning into something even stronger. When the song ended, Samuel whispered, "It's good to see you home." Ruth looked into his eyes and answered softly, "It's good to be home." The weeks that followed brought small but meaningful change. The snow began to melt, and streams of water ran down the hillsides. Birds returned to the trees, their songs breaking the long winter silence. Ruth prepared her garden for planting, turning the soil with careful hands. Samuel often stopped by to help, bringing seeds or tools. They talked of simple things, weather, crops, the future. Each day added a layer of ease to their bond. People in the village saw them together and smiled quietly. They knew what it meant to watch broken things grow whole again. The valley itself seemed to mirror their renewal, as if nature too understood that spring follows every hard season. One afternoon, Ruth and Martha sat on the porch drinking tea. The breeze carried the scent of thawed earth and fresh grass. Martha looked at her friend with quiet affection. "You know," she said, "when you came back everyone was afraid of what it might stir up, but now it feels like you've given this place something it didn't know it had lost." Ruth smiled, her eyes following a flock of birds crossing the sky. "Maybe I just reminded it to forgive itself," she said. Martha nodded slowly. "And maybe that's why you were meant to come back." The thought stayed with Ruth long after Martha left. It was true. She had returned seeking forgiveness, but she had found something greater. Purpose, a reason to live the days ahead, not just remember the ones behind. As spring deepened, Ruth began helping at the small schoolhouse. The teacher, Mrs. Clark, had asked if she could read to the children once a week. Ruth agreed and soon became a familiar figure there. The children listened eagerly to her stories, their eyes wide with wonder. She spoke of old times, of the land, of kindness, and of how every life carries a lesson. The sound of their laughter filled her with peace. She often thought of Sarah Bradley then, her friend who had once taught in that very building. Ruth felt that in some way she was continuing what Sarah had started, keeping her memory alive through every word shared. One day, after class, she stepped outside to find Samuel waiting by the fence. "You look happy," he said simply. Ruth smiled. "I am." "I didn't think I'd ever say that again." He leaned against the post, watching her. "You've changed this town more than you know." She shook her head. "No, it changed me. I just finally stopped running from it." He nodded, as if that answered a question he'd carried for years. "Then maybe we both stopped running." They stood there quietly, the air filled with the hum of spring. It was enough. The months passed gently, carrying them towards summer. The valley bloomed with life. Tall grass waving in the wind, the creek rushing clear, and wildflowers spreading across the hillsides. The church held its annual picnic by the river, and Ruth joined in with laughter. Children splashed in the shallow water, families shared food, and songs drifted over the field. Samuel sat beside her beneath a tree, his face relaxed in the sunlight. "Do you ever think about leaving again?" he asked. Ruth shook her head. "No," she said softly. "I spent too long searching for peace in other places. It was here all along." He smiled. "Then it's good you found your way back." She looked out over the field, her heart full. "Maybe I never really left. Maybe part of me was always here." As evening fell, the crowd packed up their baskets, and the sound of laughter faded into the wind. Ruth and Samuel stayed behind a little longer, watching the river glow in the dying light. "You know," Samuel said quietly, "I used to think life was about holding on. Now I think it's about learning what to let go of." Ruth nodded. "Maybe both are true. We hold on to love, and we let go of everything else." The words lingered between them like a prayer. When they finally walked back toward the village, the sky was full of stars, and the path seemed to shine beneath their feet. In the months that followed, peace became a steady companion. Ruth no longer counted years or measured time by what she had lost. She measured it by the light that touched her window each morning, by the kindness she shared, by the quiet laughter of friends. She had learned that the heart does not need to forget to heal. It only needs to remember differently. Her life had come full circle, not to repeat itself, but to show her that even what once broke her had prepared her for grace. Every day felt like a gentle reminder that redemption is not something given, it is something lived. By autumn, the hills turned gold once more, just as they had the day she arrived. Ruth often walked to the cemetery now, leaving flowers not only for her parents, but for all the years that had passed. She no longer cried there, she only smiled, whispering gratitude for the second chance she had been given. On one of those afternoons, Samuel joined her. They stood side by side, watching the leaves drift down. "It's strange," he said, "how time can hurt and heal at the same moment." Ruth nodded. "It's because it doesn't take sides. It just moves." He looked at her, his eyes soft. "And so do we." They walked back down the hill together, the sound of their footsteps blending with the rustle of leaves. When winter came again, Ruth sat by her window as snow began to fall, just as it had the year before. But now the house felt alive, filled with warmth and light. She opened her journal and wrote her final entry for the year. "I left in fear and returned in faith. I was forgotten, yet still expected, and in being expected, I remembered who I was." She closed the book, placed it on the table, and smiled. Outside, the valley rested under the calm of another season. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell rang, steady, certain, eternal. Ruth listened to its sound, her heart quiet and full. She knew that forgiveness had done its work and that life, in its quiet way, had come back home. Spring returned once more, but this time the season carried a different light. The snow that had once covered the valley was gone, and the air carried the scent of wildflowers and earth newly awakened. Ruth opened her window and felt the soft wind move through the house. The light fell across her table, where her journal rested open. She had begun to write more these days, not to hold on to the past, but to understand it. The words flowed easily, and each one seemed to lift a small weight from her heart. She wrote about faith, about home, about how forgiveness does not erase the pain, but transforms it into something that teaches. Her days had become simple and full. There was a peace that came from living without hurry, from waking with purpose, and ending each day with gratitude. The church had grown busier as the warmer months arrived. Reverend Hayes had decided to start a small outreach to families in need outside the village. Ruth was among the first to volunteer. Every Friday, a group of them gathered to prepare baskets with bread, dried fruit, and jars of preserves to take to the farms scattered across the valley. It reminded her of the fairs she once helped organize, but this time it carried a deeper meaning. Giving to others had become her way of honoring what life had given back to her. Samuel also joined the effort, often driving the old truck that carried their supplies. They spent long afternoons together, sharing quiet conversation as the road stretched ahead. Sometimes they spoke of their parents and the farm they once had. Other times they said nothing, letting the hum of the engine and the open land speak for them. One afternoon, while they were delivering food to a family on the far side of the valley, a storm began to roll in. The sky darkened, and rain fell suddenly, soaking the ground. They found shelter in an old barn. Ruth stood near the doorway, watching the rain fall in sheets across the fields. Samuel sat on a wooden crate, looking thoughtful. "It's strange," he said after a while, "how life brings us back to the same places but changes who we are when we arrive." Ruth nodded, watching the horizon blur with the rain. "Maybe that's how healing works. It doesn't take us away from the pain. It brings us back to face it with new eyes." Samuel looked at her and smiled faintly. "You've learned a lot since you came home." She turned to him, her expression calm. "I've learned to stop fighting what already happened." They stayed there until the storm passed, listening to the sound of rain against the roof, each drop echoing like a heartbeat. When they returned to the village that evening, the air was cool and clear. The streets glistened under the fading light. People stepped out of their houses to breathe in the freshness after the storm. Ruth felt a deep sense of renewal, as though the rain had washed away not only the dust of the day, but the residue of old memories that still clung to her spirit. That night, she wrote in her journal again. "The rain does not ask permission to fall," she wrote. "It comes, it cleans, it leaves everything softer." Those words stayed with her long after she closed the book. In the weeks that followed, small changes began to ripple through the village. A new family moved into one of the old houses by the river. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, both curious and bright. Ruth met them one afternoon while tending her garden. The children stopped to watch her plant flowers along the fence, their eyes wide with curiosity. "Do they grow fast?" the girl asked. Ruth smiled and handed her a seed. "They grow when you care for them," she said. The boy knelt beside her, helping to pat down the soil. From that day on, the children often visited, helping her water the plants and listening to her stories about the valley's past. Their laughter filled the air, bringing a kind of joy Ruth had almost forgotten existed. It felt as though life had placed them in her path, to remind her that new beginnings could come even after everything seemed finished. Samuel noticed the change too. He began visiting more often, bringing tools to fix the gate or wood for the stove. Sometimes he stayed for supper, and their evenings would pass in quiet comfort. The bond between them had grown steady, built not on the need to forget, but on the strength to remember without pain. Yet one evening, as the sun sank low behind the hills, Samuel brought news that unsettled her. The county was planning to build a new road that would pass directly through part of the old farmland they had once visited. It meant that the land they had laid to rest might soon be gone entirely. Ruth listened in silence. It wasn't anger that rose in her, but sadness, the quiet kind that comes from seeing a piece of history disappear. "Maybe that's how the world moves forward," Samuel said softly. "It doesn't ask if we're ready." Ruth nodded slowly. "Still, it's hard to see it go." The weeks that followed brought discussions and town meetings. Some villagers supported the road, seeing it as progress. Others resisted, wanting to preserve the land's quiet charm. Ruth stayed quiet at first, torn between both sides, but one evening she stood before the small crowd gathered in the church hall and spoke. Her voice was calm but strong. "We cannot stop change," she said, "but we can choose how we remember what came before. If the road must come, let it come through our hands. Let us plant trees beside it. Let us mark it with a stone that tells our story. Let us show that the past is not lost. It becomes the foundation we build on." The room fell silent. Her words carried the weight of experience, and even those who disagreed nodded with respect. That night, for the first time, Ruth felt not just forgiven, but listened to. When construction began months later, Ruth and Samuel stood by the edge of the field, watching the workers. The land where their family had once labored now echoed with the sound of machinery. It was difficult to watch, yet Ruth did not turn away. She knew that life demanded courage, not only to hold on, but also to let go with grace. Together, they placed a small wooden cross near the entrance of the new road. Carved into it were the words, "For those who came before and those who will follow." It was simple, humble, and true. As they stood there, the sun broke through the clouds, lighting the cross in gold. Ruth felt tears rise, but they were not of loss, they were of peace. The seasons continued to turn. The new road brought travelers and small shops to the edge of the village. Change came quietly, not as destruction, but as evolution. Ruth adapted, just as she always had. She began helping at the church's new shelter for families passing through. She cooked, sewed blankets, and offered gentle words to those who arrived tired from their journeys. People began to look to her for comfort, seeing in her the calm strength of someone who had endured and found her way back. Samuel helped too, often driving supplies or building repairs. Together they became a quiet pillar of the community, not loud, not grand, but steady and dependable, like the hills around them. Years passed in this rhythm, marked by small moments of grace. Ruth grew older, but her spirit remained light. The garden bloomed every spring, filled with colors that seemed to mirror her joy. The children she once taught grew up and came back to visit, bringing their own families. The sound of laughter returned to her porch every summer, and though time left its marks, she wore them with gratitude. She often said to Martha, who remained her closest friend, "The heart never really gets old. It just learns to rest in what is good." One quiet evening, as the sun set beyond the valley, Ruth walked to the top of the hill near the old farm road. The cross they had placed years before still stood, weathered but strong. She sat on a rock nearby, listening to the sound of the wind moving through the grass. The world below glowed in shades of gold and blue. It was the same land that had once broken her and later healed her. She thought of everything that had changed and everything that had remained. Then she whispered a prayer of gratitude for her brother, for her parents, for every season that had shaped her. As the light faded, she smiled. She understood now that redemption was not a single moment of grace, but a lifetime of small mercies. When she returned home that night, the house was quiet, the fire low. She took her journal from the table and wrote her final entry for that day. "Life has taught me that home is not a place we find. It's what we build inside us when we finally stop running." She closed the book and placed it by the window where the moonlight fell softly across its cover. Outside, the valley lay still and endless, its silence filled with peace. The years passed quietly, and Ruth's name became one that everyone in the valley spoke with warmth. Her house, once forgotten and decaying, now stood as a symbol of endurance. The fence was covered with ivy and morning glories, the porch filled with flower pots, and the path to her door was lined with smooth stones that children from the school had brought her as gifts. She had become a part of the village's rhythm, not as someone who returned from exile, but as someone who had always belonged. It was a strange kind of peace, one that came not from triumph, but from acceptance. She often said that time itself had taught her to stop looking for endings, because every ending was simply another beginning wearing a different face. One late summer morning, Ruth awoke to the sound of birds calling from the orchard behind her house. The sunlight slipped through the curtains and painted the room with a soft gold. She rose slowly, her movements calm and deliberate. The years had made her slower, but not weaker. There was still a steadiness in her that seemed to defy the passing of time. She went to the porch and looked out at the valley, now green and alive after the spring rains. Down the road, she saw Samuel walking walking toward her with his familiar stride, carrying something wrapped in cloth. When he reached the porch, he smiled. "You remember this?" he asked, unwrapping the bundle. Inside was their father's Bible, the one that had once sat on the table of the old farmhouse. Its cover was worn, its pages thin as air. Ruth touched it gently, her eyes misting. "I thought it was lost," she said softly. Samuel nodded. "I found it in one of the boxes when I was cleaning the church attic. It belongs with you now." She smiled. "No, it belongs with us." They sat together on the porch for a long while, reading passages aloud, the sound of their voices blending with the wind. When they reached the old verse about seasons and purpose, Samuel looked at her with quiet affection. "You used to read this one when you were little," he said. Ruth nodded. "It gave me courage back then. It still does." They sat in silence, the kind of silence that needs no words. The air smelled of warm earth and cut grass, and in that stillness, both of them felt the closeness of something larger than themselves, the unseen mercy that had carried them through all these years. As autumn came again, Ruth began to feel the weight of her years. It was not sickness, but a slow and steady tiredness that comes when the soul starts turning toward rest. She did not fear it. Her days were full of peace. She spent her mornings tending to the garden, her afternoons writing in her journal, and her evenings by the window watching the sun fall behind the hills. The children still came to visit, bringing laughter and small gifts from the school. Martha, now frail but still cheerful, visited every few days, and they would sit together drinking tea, speaking of old times. Samuel came by often too, sometimes just to sit quietly, his presence enough. They didn't speak of endings, only of gratitude. One evening, as the first chill of autumn arrived, Ruth sat by the fire reading her father's Bible. A phrase caught her attention. "And the heart of the righteous shall be like a tree by the water, bearing fruit even in its season of rest." She smiled at the words. It was a fitting reflection of what her life had become. Even in her rest, she had borne fruit, not through wealth or grand deeds, but through kindness that reached others quietly, like the roots of a tree spreading unseen beneath the soil. The next day, she visited the school to bring the children a basket of apples from her garden. When she arrived, the teacher greeted her warmly and asked if she would tell another story. Ruth agreed and stood before the children, her voice soft but steady. She told them about a woman who left her home long ago and returned many years later, afraid of what she might find. She spoke of forgiveness, of courage, and of how sometimes the hardest journey is not across distance but through the heart. The children listened in silence, their eyes wide. When she finished, the room was still for a moment before they began to clap, their faces glowing with admiration. Ruth smiled, her eyes glistening. She had not told them her story directly, but they understood. Some truths do not need to be named to be felt. That night, Ruth sat on her porch watching the sunset. The sky burned orange and pink, the air filled with the scent of hay and distant wood smoke. She thought about how far she had come from the day she stepped off that bus so many years ago. She had returned to face her past, and in doing so, had discovered a future she never expected. The sound of the church bell drifted through the valley, and she closed her eyes, letting it wash over her. Each toll felt like a heartbeat, steady and sure. She whispered a prayer of thanks for her family, for her friends, for the grace that had carried her all this time. As weeks passed, her strength began to fade little by little. Martha noticed first and insisted that Ruth rest more, but Ruth continued her days with calm determination. She said she had one more thing to finish before she could rest fully. Each night she sat by her lamp, writing letters. One was for Martha, thanking her for her friendship. Another was for the children at the school, telling them to keep learning and to believe that kindness was the strongest thing a person could leave behind. The last one she wrote was for Samuel. She took her time with that letter, choosing each word carefully. It spoke not of regret, but of love, the quiet, steady kind that forgives everything and expects nothing in return. Winter came again, soft and pale. The snow fell lightly over the valley, covering the fields, the church, and the road. One morning Samuel came by as usual to check on her. He found the fire still burning and the house warm. Ruth sat in her chair by the window, the Bible open on her lap, her face peaceful. She had passed in her sleep, her hands resting gently on the book that had guided her through every trial. The letter for Samuel lay beside her. He picked it up and read it slowly, his eyes filling with tears. "You were right," she had written. "Forgiveness is something we grow, and love is the harvest it leaves behind." The news spread quietly through the village. People gathered at the church to remember her. The pastor spoke of her life not as one of sorrow, but of grace. He said that Ruth had shown them all what redemption looked like, not in grand acts, but in a steady heart that never stopped believing in goodness. The church was full that day. Martha wept softly in the front pew. The children placed flowers on the altar, and Samuel sat with his hands folded, the letter still in his pocket. When the service ended, he walked alone to the hill where the cross still stood by the road. He placed Ruth's Bible beneath it and whispered, "You are home now." As the seasons turned again, the village continued on, but something in it had changed. The road that had once symbolized loss now carried life. Travelers stopping to rest, families building homes nearby, laughter filling the valley once more. Each spring, the flowers by the cross bloomed brighter than before. People said it was because Ruth had blessed the land with her kindness. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. What mattered was that she was remembered not for how she left, but for how she returned. And when the wind moved through the fields at dusk, some swore they could hear the faint sound of her laughter, light, distant, and full of peace, carried through the valley that had once waited 30 long years for her to come home. Months passed since Ruth's funeral, and the valley moved through its seasons as it always had. Yet there was something different in the air, a quiet sense that her presence still lingered among them. The people did not speak of her with sadness, but with a kind of reverence, as if she had become part of the landscape itself. Children passing by her old house would lower their voices instinctively, not out of fear, but out of respect. The garden she had tended still bloomed every spring, full of color and fragrance, cared for now by the same children she once taught. They called it Ruth's Garden, and it became a place where people came to sit when they needed peace. The wind that moved through the valley seemed to carry her calm spirit, whispering in the rustle of leaves and the soft chime of the church bell. Samuel took care of the house, keeping it exactly as she left it. He came every morning to water the flowers and sweep the porch. Some days he sat on the steps with his coffee, looking out across the valley. The silence no longer felt lonely. He would sometimes read her journal, each word a reminder of how far they had come. Her handwriting was steady, her tone gentle. In every line he could hear her voice, steady, compassionate, forgiving. One evening he found a passage that stopped him for a long time. "If one life can soften another," she had written, "then no year is wasted." He closed the journal and looked toward the horizon. It comforted him to know that her grace had not left the world. It had simply taken root in everyone she touched. The village began to change slowly in the years that followed. The new road brought travelers who stopped to rest at the small inn near the square. They would hear stories about the widow who returned after 30 years and changed everything without ever asking for attention. Visitors often went to see her garden, some leaving flowers, others small notes of gratitude. A wooden bench was placed beneath the oak tree where Ruth used to sit, and engraved on it were the words, "Forgiveness is the harvest of a faithful heart." People sat there in quiet reflection, and somehow the place always felt warmer than the rest of the valley, as if sunlight lingered longer there. Martha lived long enough to see all of this. Though her steps had grown slow, her eyes still sparkled with life. She often told the younger generation about the days when Ruth first came back, how the town was wary, how forgiveness took time, and how it changed them all in the end. She didn't preach, Martha would say. She just lived the truth she believed in. Children listened to her stories as if hearing a legend, though the truth was simple. Ruth had not performed miracles. She had simply been kind, and that kindness had spread like light in a dark room. Samuel grew older too, his hair turning the same silver Ruth's had once been. He still helped at the church, still walked the same roads, and still carried her letter folded in his pocket. On clear evenings he often climbed the hill where the cross stood by the road. The wood was weathered now, the carving faint, but the words remained. He would sit beside it, watching the sunset just as Ruth once had. The valley stretched below him, peaceful and alive. Sometimes he read from her Bible, the same one he had given back to her years ago. Its pages were worn, but the words never lost their strength. "A heart at peace gives life to the body," he read one evening, his voice breaking softly. He smiled then, not with sorrow, but with deep gratitude. As years continued, the people of the valley began an annual tradition in Ruth's memory. Each spring, on the anniversary of her return, the church held what they called the Day of Kindness. No one preached that day. There were no speeches or ceremonies. Instead, everyone was encouraged to do something good for another. Visit the sick, mend a fence, bring food to a neighbor. It became the valley's quiet promise to live the way Ruth had taught them. Children grew up knowing her name not as a story of tragedy, but as a symbol of redemption. They would look at her house and see not loss, but love that lasted beyond a lifetime. One spring, a young woman named Clara came to the valley with her husband and newborn son. They were travelers looking for a quiet place to start anew. When they asked about renting a small home, the townspeople suggested Ruth's house. At first, Clara hesitated. It felt strange to live in a place that carried so much history. But when she stepped inside, she felt something peaceful there, something warm that made her heart settle. The rooms were simple, the garden still beautiful. She decided to stay. That evening, as she placed her baby to sleep by the window, a soft breeze passed through the curtains. The lamp flickered gently, and Clara felt an unexplainable calm. It was as if the house itself had welcomed her. From that day forward, she cared for the garden as Ruth once had, keeping every plant alive and every path clean. Life had a way of continuing through those who came after. Years later, the valley itself began to prosper. The new road brought steady trade, and the people thrived without losing the quiet grace that had always defined them. The church bell still rang every morning, echoing through the fields. The bench beneath the oak became a meeting place for travelers and locals alike. Sometimes strangers would sit there without knowing the full story of Ruth, yet they always left lighter, as though they had brushed against something sacred. That was the quiet miracle she had left behind. Peace that asked for nothing but gave everything. Samuel lived to see all of it. When his time finally came, he was buried beside Ruth on the hill near the old road. The pastor who led the service said only one line that morning. They began apart, but they found their way home together. After that, no one spoke. The silence felt complete, not empty. It was the kind of silence that carries meaning, the kind Ruth herself had always understood. The wind moved gently across the grass, bending it in slow waves, and the valley stood still, as though bowing its head in respect. Decades later, travelers who passed through Tennessee would sometimes stop at a small roadside marker that read, "Ruth and Samuel's Hill." Few knew the full story behind it, but locals always smiled when asked. They would tell the same tale, how a widow once returned after 30 years and reminded an entire valley that no life is too broken to begin again. Those who listened often left with tears in their eyes and hope in their hearts. The road stretched on from there, winding through the hills like the path of a life redeemed, quiet and beautiful, leading always toward light. And in the heart of that valley, where the air still smelled of wildflowers and rain, the sound of the church bell continued to ring. Its tone carried far across the land, reaching fields, homes, and hearts, a living echo of Ruth's faith. Those who heard it did not think of sorrow, but of grace, the kind that does not fade, even when the person who carried it has gone home. Years folded gently over the valley like pages turning in a book, and the story of Ruth became something more than memory. It became a lesson woven into the life of every person who called that place home. Generations passed, yet her presence never left. The villagers spoke of her with affection and pride, and her name was mentioned not only in stories told at the church, but in the quiet guidance parents offered to their children. When a disagreement arose between neighbors, someone would say, "Remember what Ruth taught us, kindness first." When a traveler arrived weary and uncertain, they were given shelter with the words, "This is Ruth's Valley. Here we do not turn anyone away." Her influence had grown into a tradition of compassion that no season could erase. Clara's son, the little boy who had once slept beneath the same window where Ruth wrote her final words, grew up surrounded by these stories. His name was Peter, and as he grew, he became fascinated by the woman whose home he had inherited. He would sit on the bench beneath the oak, reading old journal entries that Samuel had preserved. The pages were fragile, but the words carried a strength that touched him deeply. "Forgiveness is the courage to begin again," one passage said, "and faith is believing that even the hardest ground can bloom." Those sentences became the foundation of Peter's life. He became a teacher at the same school where Ruth once read to children, passing her lessons to a new generation who never met her but felt as though they had. One summer morning, while the church bell rang across the fields, Peter gathered his students in the garden. He told them about the woman who came home after 30 years, afraid but hopeful, and how her return changed everything. The children listened with wide eyes, imagining her walking through the same paths they knew. "What do you think made her brave enough to come back?" Peter asked. A little girl raised her hand. "Because she wanted to make things right," she said. Peter smiled. "Yes," he answered, "and because she believed people could change." It was simple, but it was truth. The children planted flowers in the garden that day, saying each one was for someone they wanted to forgive. By evening, the garden shone with color, a living reminder that her spirit still worked quietly through the hearts of those who came after. The valley itself had transformed over time, but its soul remained the same. The old road had widened, carrying travelers who often stopped at the small chapel by Ruth and Samuel's hill. Some came to pray, others just to sit and breathe. The chapel walls were lined with wooden plaques carved with short messages left by visitors, prayers of gratitude, confessions of regret, promises to return home. Among them, one message was repeated more than any other: "It's never too late." That phrase had become the valley's motto. It was painted on the school wall, carved into the church door, and printed on the annual fair banners each year. People who lived there said those words carried power, as if Ruth herself whispered them into the wind whenever someone lost hope. Every spring, Clara, now older, walked to the hill with her grandchildren. They carried baskets of flowers to place near the cross. The children asked questions each time: who Ruth was, why people remembered her, why her story mattered. Clara would tell them gently, "Because she showed us that love can outlive mistakes, because she came back when she didn't have to." Then she would point to the valley below. "Look around," she would say. "All this, the gardens, the laughter, the peace, it's because someone once chose to forgive instead of forget." The children would listen quietly, their young minds holding on to the truth, even before they fully understood it. One of those children, a girl named Anna, grew especially attached to Ruth's story. She loved to sit on the porch of the old house, sketching the hills and the flowers in her notebook. When she grew older, she began to write small reflections about life, faith, and home. Her words carried the same simplicity that Ruth once used. "We are all someone's second chance," she wrote in one of her notebooks. Years later, her writings were published, and people far beyond the valley read them. She never claimed the wisdom as her own. She always said she had learned it from the woman who came back. Through her, Ruth's legacy spread far beyond Tennessee, reaching hearts in places Ruth had never known. People wrote letters to Anna, saying how her stories helped them forgive their families, mend broken ties, and believe again in quiet miracles. The valley became known as a place of healing, visited by people searching for peace. The church, too, carried Ruth's legacy forward. Reverend Hayes had long since passed, but each new pastor spoke of her story at least once a year, reminding everyone that true faith is not found in sermons, but in the way one lives after falling. Her old Bible remained in the church, displayed inside a glass case near the altar. The pages were faded, the spine cracked, but people often stood before it in silence. They said the air around it felt different, calm, steady, filled with something sacred. Some would close their eyes and whisper their own prayers for forgiveness or strength, trusting that Ruth's quiet grace would somehow reach them still. One evening, during the celebration of the Day of Kindness, the valley gathered as they always did. Lanterns lined the road, their light reflecting off the river. Music played softly, and families shared food beneath the stars. As the night deepened, Peter stood before the crowd. His hair was grey now, his face marked with age, but his voice carried the same gentleness that had filled Ruth's home long ago. "She once wrote that forgiveness is like planting a seed," he said. You may not see it grow in your time, but it will become shade for someone else. He looked out over the people, generations bound together by her story, and continued, "Tonight, we live under that shade. It is our turn to plant for those who come after." The crowd fell silent, then nodded. Many eyes were wet with tears, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. As the lanterns floated down the river, their glow traced a golden path across the dark water. People watched in silence, their hearts full. Above them, the stars shimmered, and the sound of the church bell drifted through the valley once more. It was the same sound Ruth had heard when she first returned home, echoing across time and memory. Some said that if you listened closely, you could still hear her footsteps in the wind, walking the same road, her spirit moving gently among the people she had loved so deeply. In the quiet that followed, Clara's granddaughter, now grown, whispered to the person beside her, "Do you think she knows how much she changed us?" The old man smiled softly. "I think she does, because everything good we have now began the moment she chose to come back." The words lingered in the cool night air, as if carried by the same breath that once filled Ruth's final prayers. And so the valley lived on, humble, faithful, and full of grace. The roads were smoother now, the houses newer, but beneath it all remained the same enduring truth, that one act of courage, one heart willing to forgive, can change the course of many lives. The people of the valley called it Ruth's gift. They believed it was not just her story, but a reminder for anyone who had ever lost their way, that no matter how far you go, there is always a road that leads you back home. Decades had passed since Ruth's story first began to echo through the valley, yet even now her name carried a quiet power. The older generations spoke of her with affection, and the younger ones listened with reverence, as if she were a bridge between the living and the remembered. The world beyond the valley had changed. Machines hummed in places that once held silence, and travelers came from far cities to see what they called the town that forgave. But the people who lived there never thought of it as a miracle. They simply said that Ruth had taught them how to live with open hearts. Her story had become part of their breath, their rhythm, their way of being. Each spring, the hillsides burst into bloom earlier than anywhere else in the county. Farmers swore it was because the soil near the church and the old house was blessed. The church bell still rang at dawn and dusk, its sound stretching for miles. Some said it sounded clearer now than it had in generations past. Others said it was the same. It was just that they had learned how to listen. In every home, the lessons Ruth left behind still lived in small gestures. Neighbors still checked on each other when the cold came. Families still left baskets of food by the church door for those in need. And whenever there was conflict, the first thing people asked was, what would Ruth have done? The answer was always the same. She would have forgiven. Peter, now old and grey, spent most of his days walking along the river where the lanterns floated each year. His joints were stiff, but his spirit was light. Children followed him as he told stories of the past. He carried Ruth's journal with him everywhere, its pages bound now in leather to preserve what time tried to wear away. One afternoon, a child asked him why he still carried it after all these years. Peter smiled and said, "Because some words should never be forgotten." He opened to a page and read aloud, his voice soft over the wind. "When you cannot change what has happened, change what it means." The children listened, their eyes reflecting the light of the water. That single line became a proverb, repeated across the valley for generations to come. Far beyond the town, Ruth's influence continued to spread. Travelers who once stopped to rest carried her story with them. A journalist passing through wrote an article about the valley, calling it a place where grace still lives. The story reached far corners of the country, and people began to write letters asking about the widow who had changed a village's heart. Some even visited, searching for peace, leaving prayers written on scraps of paper tied to the fence around Ruth's garden. The townspeople never turned anyone away. They simply said, "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." The innkeeper kept a guest book, and over the years, it filled with thousands of names from around the world. Each one left a message, words of healing, confession, and hope. One winter, when Peter's health began to fail, he asked to be taken to the hill where Ruth and Samuel rested. The snow was deep, the wind cold, but the villagers carried him up the path with care. He sat beside the cross and looked out over the land. The world below glowed white and silent, "She would have liked this," he whispered. A young boy beside him asked, "Do you think she knows we're still talking about her?" Peter smiled faintly. "I think she knew before we ever said a word." He closed his eyes then, his breath slowing. The boy held his hand until the last moment of light left the sky. That night, the church bell rang longer than usual, and the sound carried farther than anyone remembered. When spring returned, the villagers built a small stone wall around the graves on the hill, planting flowers between the stones. They placed a wooden sign above it that read, "The Garden of Second Chances." It became the heart of the valley, a place where people came not to mourn, but to begin again. Travelers came from other towns, some from far states, bringing pieces of their own stories. They said that when they stood there, they felt lighter, as if the earth itself listened. The pastor who now led the church said it was because the land had absorbed years of prayer. Others said it was simply love that refused to fade. Over the next decades, Ruth's house became a small museum cared for by volunteers. Inside, her Bible and journal were kept in glass cases, the pages still open to her favorite verses. The walls were covered with letters people had sent, stories of reconciliation, apologies made, families restored. There was no sign asking for donations, no entry fee. People simply left whatever they wished: a coin, a flower, a note. Some visitors sat on the porch and cried quietly, not from sadness, but from the recognition that the peace they felt was real. Even those who didn't believe in miracles left believing in something gentler, that goodness could live on through the choices of ordinary people. In time, a documentary filmmaker visited the valley. He spent weeks interviewing the residents, walking the roads Ruth once walked, filming the fields, the church, and the garden. When the film was released, it reached millions. People who had never heard of the valley before found comfort in the story of one widow who returned home after 30 years. Letters flooded in from all over the world. Strangers wrote about reconciling with siblings, forgiving parents, or returning to hometowns they had left long ago. The valley began to receive visitors not just for its beauty, but for its lesson that peace could grow anywhere a heart chose to plant it. Through all the changes, one truth remained. Every evening when the church bell rang, people paused whatever they were doing. Farmers stopped their plows, shopkeepers set down their tools, and children stood still. They bowed their heads for a moment of silence, not a prayer of sorrow, but a promise to continue what Ruth had begun. That single tradition endured more strongly than any law or ritual. The valley had no grand monument, no statue in her name. Its monument was the way people treated one another. Kindness had become their faith, and forgiveness their inheritance. One night, many years later, Clara's granddaughter Anna, now an elderly woman herself, walked up the hill alone. The moon hung low, silver light spilling over the stones. She carried a lantern and a small bouquet of lilies. She placed them by the cross and sat for a long time, listening to the quiet. The air smelled of pine and rain, just as Ruth once described in her journals. Anna whispered softly, "You never really left. You just became everything around us." The wind stirred gently, brushing against her face, and for a fleeting moment she felt warmth move through the cold air, not a ghostly presence, but a simple tenderness, as if the valley itself answered her. As she walked down the hill, she looked back once more. The lantern's light glowed softly against the night. It was a small light, yet it felt endless, a reflection of the story that would never die. Ruth's journey had begun in sorrow and ended in grace, but her legacy belonged to everyone who still believed in second chances. The valley was no longer just a place on a map. It had become a living testament to the idea that love, when nurtured, can outlast everything else. And when the dawn came, washing the sky in pale gold, the church bell rang again, steady, pure, and certain, carrying across the fields, over the roads, through every open window, and into the hearts of those who still listened. Morning returned to the valley with the same quiet rhythm it had known for more than a century. The mist rose slowly from the river, and sunlight touched the old church steeple before spilling across the rooftops. Time had changed faces, roads, and fields, but it had never changed the soul of this place. It still carried the calm that Ruth left behind. Every generation had its own struggles, its own mistakes, its own pain to mend, but the people here never forgot where their peace had begun. They said the valley breathed through the sound of the bell, and that each ring was a reminder to choose grace over pride. The garden behind Ruth's house was larger now. Paths of white stone wound between rows of roses, lilies, and wild daisies. Travelers still came, some old, some young, many carrying burdens unseen. They walked the garden in silence, as if the flowers could listen. A small wooden sign at the entrance read, "Welcome home." No one knew who first placed it there, but no one ever dared to move it. Beneath that sign, visitors often stood for a long time, feeling something they couldn't name, as if the earth itself recognized them and offered forgiveness without words. The house had become a small refuge. Volunteers tended it year-round, and a woman named Emily, one of the many descendants of those who had once known Ruth, lived there now as caretaker. She welcomed guests with tea, showed them the journals, and shared the story of the widow who had returned after 30 years. Her voice was calm, her manner gentle. Sometimes, when the wind rustled through the trees outside, Emily would pause and smile softly, saying, "She's still here." People would look around quietly, as if half expecting to see a shadow near the porch or hear a soft step in the hall. Yet what they felt was not haunting, it was presence, the kind that comes when love refuses to end. One autumn afternoon, a group of students arrived from a distant city. They were studying history and faith, sent by a professor who had read about Ruth in a book on moral transformation. Emily guided them through the valley, showing them the church, the hill, and the old road that once led her home. The students asked questions, but mostly they listened. At the top of the hill, one of them, a young woman with bright eyes, turned to Emily and asked, "Do you really believe one person can change so much?" Emily looked out at the valley stretched below them, golden in the late sun. "Yes," she said softly, "because kindness is never wasted. It keeps moving, even when we're gone." The students stood quietly after that, each carrying the weight of those words in their hearts. Later that evening, the same young woman sat alone by the church steps, watching the sunset. The air was cool, the world around her still. She thought of her own life, the arguments left unresolved, the family she had drifted from, the apologies she had never said. Somewhere deep inside, she felt something shift. When she returned home weeks later, she wrote to her father after years of silence. She didn't mention the valley or Ruth's story, but her letter carried the same message that had changed the valley long ago. Forgiveness is stronger than pride. The quiet legacy continued, not through grand monuments or loud proclamations, but through hearts softened one by one. Generations kept turning like the seasons, but Ruth's memory grew brighter instead of fading. Her story traveled beyond Tennessee, carried by visitors who spoke of the peace they found there. Writers mentioned her in essays, preachers quoted her words in sermons, and artists painted scenes of the valley glowing beneath the bell's golden sound. Yet within the valley itself, life stayed humble. The people didn't see their home as famous, they saw it as blessed. When the harvest came, they still gathered at the church with baskets of grain and fruit, thanking God for another year of mercy. And when the bell rang each night, they still paused for that small moment of silence, letting gratitude settle over them like evening light. In the final pages of Ruth's oldest journal, there was one passage that Emily often read aloud to visitors. The ink had faded, but the words remained clear. "If someone should find this, tell them I was once lost, but found my way home. Tell them peace is not a gift given to the lucky, but a seed grown by those who dare to forgive." She would close the journal then, letting the quiet speak for her. People often wept after hearing it, not out of sadness, but because the truth of it reached something deep inside them. That sentence had become the valley's prayer, whispered in kitchens, repeated at gravesides, written on scraps of paper left in the garden. Forgiveness had become their inheritance, passed from heart to heart. The valley flourished for many more generations, but even as time brought new buildings and faces, nothing ever replaced the feeling of that simple truth. Children still ran barefoot along the dirt paths Ruth once walked. The church bell still called them home at dusk. The fields still shimmered in the morning light, and the wind still carried the faint fragrance of lilies from the garden. Visitors often said that the valley didn't just exist on a map. It existed in the space between sorrow and grace, where people learned to start again. And when dusk came each day, as the sun touched the hills for a final moment, the bell rang once more. Its tone was deep and soft, reaching beyond the farms, over the houses, into the hearts of those who listened from afar. It was as if Ruth herself still whispered through the sound, "Come home. It's never too late." But that night the valley slept under a sky filled with stars, the same stars that once watched a young widow walk a lonely road back to her past, now shone over a place transformed by her courage. The world beyond kept changing, but here faith remained, quiet and unbroken. People said that heaven must sound like that bell, steady, patient, and full of mercy. And so her story ended not in loss, but in light. It became a prayer carried on the wind, an echo across generations, a promise kept by time itself, that kindness once sown can never truly die. It simply grows, finding new hearts to bloom in over and over again. Thank you for joining us in this story of faith and redemption. If it touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Because sometimes the most incredible stories are not the ones we invent, they're the ones that truly happened.